I've been driving a taxi for nearly 15 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. Drunks, late-night confessions, people running from something, people running to something. But nothing prepared me for the night I took that call. I'd been working the night shift, cruising the empty streets of Windham, New Hampshire. It was one of those October nights where the chill hangs in the air, heavy with the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. Business was slow, and I was about to call it quits when the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "Got one for you, Greg," she said. "Pick up at 19 Barrow Lane." I frowned, leaning over to check the GPS. Barrow Lane wasn't on my usual routes. In fact, I didn't remember it at all. "Where's that?" I asked. "Out by the forest. Just take Route 12 until the turnoff. Shouldn't be more than 10 minutes. I considered it. Forest roads at night weren't my favorite, but a fare was a fare, and the money wasn't going to make itself. "Got it," I said, flipping the meter on and turning onto Route 12. The drive was uneventful at first. The road was quiet, lined with towering pines that seemed to press closer the farther I went. My headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating patches of mist that hovered like ghostly sentinels. Barrow Lane turned out to be a narrow dirt road, almost invisible in the gloom. I hesitated for a moment, then turned down it. The address led me to a clearing deep in the woods. There was no house, no mailbox, just a group of people standing in the mist. My first thought was that it was some kind of prank. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in history books or on Halloween costumes. Long coats, high-collared dresses, wide-brimmed hats. But it wasn't the clothes that unnerved me. It was the way they stood there, silent and still, their faces pale and indistinct, as if the mist was clinging to them. I rolled down the window a crack. "You call for a cab?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive quiet. They didn't answer. Instead, one of them, a woman with a tattered shawl wrapped around her shoulders, raised a hand and pointed to the back seat. I hesitated. Something about them didn't feel right, but I figured they were just eccentric locals or maybe actors from some historical reenactment. I unlocked the doors. "All right, get in." They moved slowly, almost reluctantly, sliding into the back seat without a word. There were 4 of them, their pale faces barely visible in the rearview mirror. The last one to get in was a man in a black coat and hat, his face hidden in shadow. He shut the door with a soft click and pointed down the road. "You're not gonna tell me where we're headed?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. No answer. "Fine," I muttered, pulling back onto the road. The fog thickened as we drove, curling around the car like living tendrils. The trees seemed taller here, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out even the faintest light. The only sound was the rumble of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. I tried to make conversation, anything to cut through the suffocating silence. "So, you guys headed to a party? Or maybe some kind of event?" Nothing. Their stillness was unsettling. They didn't fidget, didn't talk among themselves. They just sat there, staring straight ahead, their faces unnervingly blank. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and for a moment, I thought I saw their features shift, like smoke caught in a breeze. I tightened my grip on the wheel. "Look, if you don't tell me where we're going, I'm gonna have to drop you off. I don't do joyrides." The man in the black coat leaned forward, his face still hidden. His hand shot out, pointing to a fork in the road. The movement was so sudden, so forceful, that I jumped. All right, I muttered, taking the left turn. The road grew rougher, the trees pressing closer until their branches scraped against the car like fingernails. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see a few feet ahead. The GPS had long since stopped working, and I had no idea where we were. That's when I noticed the cold. It seeped into the car, chilling me to the bone. I turned up the heater, but it didn't help. My breath fogged the windshield, and I could feel the weight of their silence pressing down on me like a physical force. Then the smell hit me. It was faint at first, like damp earth and rotting leaves. but it grew stronger with each passing minute. A sickly sweet stench that made my stomach churn. I cracked the window, hoping for some fresh air, but it only made it worse. The smell seemed to be coming from inside the car. I glanced in the mirror again, and my heart nearly stopped. The passengers were gone. The back seat was empty, but the air was heavy, charged with an oppressive energy that made my skin crawl. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. "What the hell?" I whispered. That's when I saw the blood. It was smeared across the seats, dark and glistening, soaking into the fabric. My stomach lurched as I realized it wasn't just on the seats. It was dripping onto the floor, pooling around my feet. The stench was unbearable now, the metallic tang of blood mixed with decay. A low sound filled the car, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. It grew louder, more insistent, until it became a chorus of voices, overlapping and echoing, their words indistinguishable but filled with anger, pain, and despair. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. The voices stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. My heart pounded as I turned to look at the back seat, my breath catching in my throat. Scrawled across the fogged-up rear window, in letters that dripped like fresh blood, was a message: "Don't ever come back." I didn't need to be told twice. I drove like a madman, the tires screeching as I tore back down the road. The fog seemed to part for me, the trees blurring into dark smudges as I raced toward the main road. By the time I reached Route 12, the blood was gone, the stench replaced by the crisp, clean scent of autumn air. I didn't stop until I was back in town, parked under the harsh glow of a street lamp. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely light a cigarette. I told myself it was just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But when I checked the back seat, I found something that made my blood run cold. A single handprint, faint but unmistakable, pressed into the fogged-up glass of the rear window. I never took another fare out by the forest. I never even drove Route 12 again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that message, "Don't ever come back." And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't listened. If you ever find yourself out there, on those misty back roads, do yourself a favor, turn around, go back the way you came, because some roads aren't meant to be traveled, and some passengers aren't meant to be picked up. Story number 2. The Death Loop. It started as a simple drive home. I'd been visiting a friend in a nearby town, and as usual, I stayed longer than I should have. By the time I left, it was late, nearly midnight. The roads were quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. My GPS chirped as I turned onto a side road, one I didn't recognize. Recalculating, it said in its cheerful, robotic voice. I sighed, annoyed but trusting it to get me home. It had always done the job before. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars, and lined on either side by thick, dark forest. The trees loomed over the asphalt, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms. My high beams lit up the road ahead, but the darkness seemed thicker here, almost alive. First, it felt like any other late-night drive. The radio was playing softly, my phone's GPS calmly issuing directions. But then I passed the first sign. A rusty, weathered no entry sign stood at the side of the road, half hidden by overgrown weeds. I slowed down, glancing at it as I drove past. There was nothing particularly unusual about it, except that it seemed out of place. This was supposed to be a public road. I kept driving, telling myself it was just an old sign someone had forgotten to remove. But 10 minutes later, I passed it again. I stopped the car, staring at the sign through the windshield. It was identical to the one I'd just seen. Same rust, same crooked angle, same weeds growing around it. My stomach tightened. I double-checked the GPS. The glowing blue line insisted I was on the right path. In 500 feet, turn left. It chirped. I followed the instructions, turning down another narrow road. The trees seemed denser here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The headlights barely penetrated the gloom, and I had to slow down to navigate the sharp curves. And then, there it was again, the same "No entry" sign. Only this time, it looked older. The rust had spread further, and the letters were faded, almost unreadable. The air in the car felt heavier, like something unseen was pressing down on me. By the third time I saw the sign, my hands were shaking. It was unmistakable now. I was going in circles. But how? I hadn't made any wrong turns. I'd followed the GPS exactly. The sign was different again, nearly falling apart now, with holes eaten through the metal and vines curling around the post. The trees, too, seemed off. They were closer to the road. Their trunks gnarled and twisted like they'd been contorted by some unseen force. I turned the car around, deciding to head back the way I came. But no matter how many turns I made, no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape that damn sign. Each time I passed it, the forest felt darker, the air colder, and then I noticed something else. The shadows between the trees weren't just shadows anymore. They moved. I don't know how long I drove, an hour, maybe 2. Time felt strange, stretched thin like a fraying rope. The gas gauge was dipping dangerously low, and the GPS had stopped giving directions altogether. The screen displayed only a spinning icon, like it was lost too. I was about to stop and call for help when I saw it. Up ahead, barely illuminated by the headlights, was another car parked on the side of the road. Relief flooded through me. Maybe I wasn't alone out here after all. I slowed down as I approached, but my relief turned to dread when I got a better look. It wasn't just any car, it was my car. Same make, same model, even the same cracked taillight I'd been meaning to fix for months. And sitting inside, slumped over the wheel, was me. I froze, my foot hovering over the brake. The figure in the other car lifted its head. It was me, but not me. His face was wrong, distorted, like a reflection in shattered glass. The eyes were too wide, the smile too sharp, the skin stretched too tight over the bones. He grinned at me, a twisted parody of my own expression, and raised a hand in a slow, mocking wave. My heart pounded as I slammed on the accelerator, swerving around the doppelganger's car. The tires screeched as I sped down the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing in the other car didn't follow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me. I don't know how I found my way out. One moment, I was trapped in that endless loop, and the next, I was back on a main road, the forest receding in my rearview mirror. I pulled over at the first gas station I saw, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. The clock on the dashboard read 3:17 a.m. I should have been home hours ago, but I couldn't remember how much time had passed, or what had happened in that stretch of road. The car was filthy, covered in dirt and leaves, like I'd been driving through the woods for days. And when I got out to inspect it, I found something scratched into the driver's side door. For words, etched deep into the paint. "You can't escape US." I sold the car a week later. It was stupid. I know. Selling the car didn't make the memories go away. Didn't stop the nightmares. Sometimes, I think about that road, about the sign and the trees and the thing that wore my face. I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear it, the faint hum of an engine, the crunch of gravel, and a low, distorted laugh that echoes just beyond the edge of the dark. Story number 3. The shadow in the rearview mirror. I've always hated driving through the woods at night. Something about the way the trees press in, like dark giants leaning closer with every mile, has always put me on edge. But that night, I didn't have a choice. I had stayed too late at a business meeting in New Haven, and my route home to Burlington took me through miles of unlit forest roads. It was just me, the car, and the darkness, or so I thought. The first hour of the drive passed uneventfully. The hum of the tires on asphalt was almost soothing, and the beams of my headlights carved a safe path through the endless trees. But as the road stretched on, I began to notice something. An itch at the back of my neck, a sense of being watched. I glanced into the rearview mirror instinctively. Empty. Just the back seat and the faint shadows it caught from the overhead light. I shook my head and focused back on the road. It was probably just the late hour playing tricks on me. I'd been awake since 5 that morning, and the caffeine I'd been guzzling all day was starting to turn on me. That's what I told myself. Anyway, about 20 minutes later, the feeling came back. Stronger this time. It wasn't just an itch now, it was a weight. A pressure bearing down on my shoulders and chest. The forest seemed darker, the trees looming larger, and the air in the car felt heavy, almost claustrophobic. I checked the rearview mirror again, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, hunched and formless, was sitting in the back seat. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My heart was pounding as I whipped around to look directly at the back seat. It was empty. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, the engine idling softly in the silence. The back seat was empty. Of course it was. The darkness outside must have played tricks on my eyes. But when I glanced back at the mirror, the shadow was there again. It didn't move. It just sat there, a vague, shifting form, like smoke trapped in a shape. Its face, if you could call it that, was indistinct, a dark void, but the eyes, they were the only clear thing about it. 2 burning red pinpoints of light, staring at me through the mirror. I froze, unable to look away. My breath fogged the glass, and my hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly they ached. The shadow didn't blink, didn't shift. It just existed, watching me. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed. Finally, I forced myself to move. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, leaving the door open. The night air was cold and sharp, but it did little to calm me. I walked around to the back seat, peering in through the windows. Still nothing. When I got back in, the shadow was waiting for me. This time, it looked closer. I kept driving because I didn't know what else to do. Staying there on the side of the road felt even worse than being in the car. Maybe I thought I could outrun it, leave it behind somehow. But no matter how fast I went, no matter how far the road stretched, the shadow stayed in the mirror. I tried everything. Turning the interior lights on did nothing. The shadow seemed unaffected by the brightness. Turning the mirror to face the ceiling didn't help either. I could still feel it, still sense its eyes burning holes in my back. At one point, I even pulled over and left the car running while I stood outside, staring into the woods. The silence out there was suffocating, and the trees seemed to lean closer, like they were listening. After 10 minutes, I got back in, and the shadow was still there, more solid than before. Its eyes looked brighter now. They didn't just reflect light, they emanated it, faint and red, like embers glowing in the dark. I started talking to it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it would help. "What do you want?" I asked. My voice sounded small and ridiculous in the enclosed space. "Why are you here?" It didn't respond, of course, but somehow, I knew it was listening. I could feel its presence growing stronger, the air in the car growing colder with every mile. The heater was on full blast, but my breath still fogged the windshield. The road seemed endless now, a black ribbon that twisted and curved in ways it hadn't before. I began to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn, but the GPS showed the same route, straight through the forest. The trees were different too. They looked closer, their branches clawing at the edges of the road like they were trying to pull me in. And then, the shadow moved. It didn't shift much, just a slight tilt of its head. But it was enough. My pulse spiked as I stared into the mirror. Unable to look away, the shadow's eyes burned brighter, and for the first time, I could make out something resembling a face. It wasn't human, couldn't be. The features were too sharp, too wrong, as if someone had tried to sculpt a person but lost interest halfway through. I screamed. The car swerved as I lost control for a moment, the tires skidding on the damp road. The shadow didn't flinch, didn't react. It just stared. That's when I decided to stop the car for good. I slammed on the brakes and threw the door open, stumbling out into the road. My legs were shaky, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't know what I was doing, running, maybe, or trying to get far enough away that I could think straight. But as I turned to look at the car, I saw it. The shadow was no longer in the mirror. It was in the back seat, clear as day now, its form solid and its eyes blazing. And it was grinning at me, a wide, jagged grin that stretched too far across its face. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The car was still running, the headlights cutting through the mist, but it felt like the only light in an endless sea of darkness. The shadow didn't follow me. It just sat there, watching, waiting. I don't remember much after that. At some point, I got back in the car. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could escape it, or maybe I was too terrified to stay outside. The last thing I remember is the sound of the tires skidding, the steering wheel jerking out of my hands as the car veered off the road. They found me the next morning. The car crumpled against a tree at the bottom of a ravine. The paramedics said I was lucky to be alive. I didn't feel lucky. When they pulled me out, I asked if they saw it, if there was anything in the back seat. They just looked at me like I was crazy. But when I saw the car later, I knew it hadn't been my imagination. The back seat was scorched, blackened like it had been licked by flames, and etched into the rearview mirror, in jagged, angry letters, was a single word: mine. I don't drive through the woods at night anymore. Hell, I barely drive at all. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a window or a mirror, I swear I see it, the shadow, waiting just behind me, and its eyes are still burning.